Liberals have driven a narrative on race that is as damaging to the West as it is broken and confusing. I have talked a few times about how the liberal narrative on race and racism is creating a toxic political and social environment in the West, and how this narrative is even leading to a situation where those of European descent are treated as second-class citizens and even attacked because of the misguided belief that white people are inherently evil. Often, these insane liberal thought processes are referred to as doublethink. Now, this is a word taken from George Orwell's novel 1984. But what does doublethink actually mean? Well, doublethink is the acceptance of contrary opinions or beliefs at the same time, especially as a result of political indoctrination. And really, there's no better example of doublethink than the liberal narrative on race. So here goes. Let's start with the first of the big points on race that liberals love to shout the loudest about, and that's the belief that racism is the biggest issue the West faces, and that racism needs confronting and tackling, and that racists are the most evil people in today's world, and thus these racists should not be tolerated, and as a consequence, racists should either be silenced, hounded out of their workplaces or other institutions, and even be physically confronted. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of organisations across the Western world that push this narrative. I read this from medium.com, and I quote, "In counselling many white Americans who are against racism, one thing stands out. They are afraid to confront their racist family members and friends. They are against racism, but they also love their family and friends. I am often asked, 'April, I don't know what to do. How do I confront them without upsetting them?' Racism is complex in scope because it is both a mental illness and a value. In other words, it is a valued, sheltered, and protected mental illness. One might even say it has been incubated and allowed to fester throughout the course of American history." End quote. So there you have it. Not only do racists need confronting, but they are also mentally ill. And of course, they are white. This conveniently takes us on to the second part of the liberal narrative on race, which is that all whites are racist. Now, this is a huge issue, especially when taken in conjunction with the first part of the liberal narrative. We've already learned that liberals believe that racists shouldn't be tolerated and should be hounded out of their jobs and confronted. But at the same time, liberals tell us that all whites are racist. So by logical extension, that means that liberals believe that all whites are essentially fair game for abuse, harassment, and even physical attacks. Two notable examples of this narrative popped up last year. The first was when a transgender model, Monroe Bergdorf, called all whites racist. The second was when the head of Cambridge University's equality group, Jason Osamide Okunde, said the same thing. He, however, went much further. I read this from the Daily Mail, and I quote, "The student head of Cambridge's equality group has claimed that all white people are racist after praising rioters in Dalston who lit bonfires and hurled petrol bombs at police. Jason Osamide Okunde, who runs the Black and Minority Ethnic Society at the elite institution, posted the shocking tweets amid violent protests in East London last night over the death of Rashan Charles. He said that white people had colonised Dalston and ordered them to go back to areas such as Exeter and Solihull. Okunde, 20, wrote to his thousands of Twitter followers, 'All white people are racist. White middle class, white working class, white men, white women, white gays, white children. They can all get it.' End quote. Note that he said all whites can get it. What did he mean by this? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. But isn't that in itself racist? Isn't claiming that all whites are racist in itself a form of racism against white people? Well, the answer to that, from a liberal standpoint, is no. as the third part of the liberal narrative on race is that whites can't be victims of racism. And this is because racism, according to liberals, is part of a power hierarchy and is directly due to privilege. And as whites are the most privileged in society, something liberals refer to as white privilege, whites apparently hold the power in society, so they cannot be victims of racism. So if someone of African descent abuses a white person, even if the nature of the abuse is racial, liberals would not view this as racist, as people of colour, as liberals term them, cannot be racist to whites, as they don't hold power within Western society. I read this headline from Vice, and I quote, "Dear white people, please stop pretending reverse racism is real. It's literally impossible to be racist to a white person." End quote. So here we are, and so far the liberal narrative has told us that racism shouldn't be tolerated, that all whites are racist, thus all whites are essentially fair game to be confronted for their racism, and those who do stand up and confront whites for these reasons are not in any way racist, and are in fact still classed as the victims regardless of their behaviour. And to top it all off, there is no comeback for whites. There is no counter-argument to this thought process within the liberal narrative, because whites can never be the victims of racism, because apparently reverse racism, as liberals call it, is literally impossible. But the rabbit hole of insanity goes even deeper. According to the liberal narrative on race, people of colour have no power in society. Thus, liberals claim that people of colour are often disenfranchised, and that, according to liberals, is why we need special programs and quotas to ensure that people of colour are given a leg up. Policies such as affirmative action in the United States that are designed to give a leg up to people of colour are endorsed by liberals as a way to achieve equality between the races. And liberals claim that these policies make sure that whites don't automatically win at everything due to their privilege. So liberals push for laws and legislation that ensure people of colour are given special preference for employment, university spaces, and other opportunities based simply on the grounds of their race. But apparently, this special treatment does not amount to a privilege, as liberals will happily tell you only whites have privilege. I read this from the Washington Post, and I quote, "Actually, we still need affirmative action for African Americans in college admissions. Here's why. President Trump's Justice Department has decided to launch a project to identify and then sue universities that they deem to have affirmative action policies that discriminate against whites in admissions. The department, as this story reports, is looking for outside attorneys to participate because staffers who handle education issues did not want to do it out of concerns it was contrary to the office's long-running approach to civil rights in education opportunities. Though affirmative action in college admissions for African Americans has been losing support in the United States for some time, with supposed colourblind methods of admissions gaining ground in the courts, there are powerful arguments for why the practice is still needed." End quote. But whilst liberals are quick to take up the struggle for equality and endorse affirmative action to even out inequalities between races, which as they see it are due to discrimination which is caused by so-called white privilege, the final part of the liberal doublethink is that actually race doesn't exist. I read this from an article in the New York Times, and I quote, "Race and racial identity are social constructs. Race is not biological. It is a social construct. There is no gene or cluster of genes common to all blacks or all whites. Were race real, in the genetic sense, racial classifications for individuals would remain constant across boundaries. Yet, a person who could be considered black in the United States might be considered white in Brazil or coloured in South Africa." End quote. Yes, Despite all that has been said earlier, liberals think race is actually a social construct, something that humans created. Liberals believe race has no basis in science. So after all of the earlier points about how racism must be tackled, how whites are the only ones who can be racist, how people of colour cannot be racist as they have no power, and how people of colour must be given a leg up, after all of that, liberals then state that race doesn't exist. So should we all just be colourblind? Should we not even see race? Not even acknowledge race and view everyone as equal and the same? Is that the ultimate lesson that can be taken from the liberal narrative on race? Well, no. According to doublethink, if you approach every issue without taking race into account, essentially, if you look at people in what is known as a colourblind manner, then sorry, according to the liberals, you're part of the problem. I read this from Vox, and I quote, "Race isn't biologically real. That doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. The first step to fixing a problem is acknowledging it exists." And in the latest episode of MTV's Decoded, host Francesca Ramsey breaks down exactly why being colourblind to someone's race not only doesn't fix racism, but, if anything, she says, actually makes matters worse. Have you ever wondered why people say, "Oh, I don't see colour," as a way to fix racism? Ramsey asks. Yeah. That doesn't work. Sure, race is not biologically real, but Ramsey points out that resting on that argument alone is part of the problem. Colourblindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism, she said. Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others. Ignoring it just lets those problems persist. End quote. So there you have it. The doublethink is finally complete. Race doesn't exist, but we should confront racists, also known as white people, because only white people can be racist, which is a thought process that leads to white people being attacked by people of colour. But those attacks aren't racist, as people of colour can't be racist. And although race doesn't exist, we should set up racial programs to give people of colour a leg up and create a colourblind world. But those who act in a colourblind manner are actually part of the problem, as they don't acknowledge race, which is of course, according to liberals, something that doesn't exist. This is doublethink, and doublethink is a cancer on the West. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.